What if everything you thought you knew about King Arthur was wrong? What if the greatest threat to Britain didn't just come from Saxons or Romans, but from the terrifying Viking storm rising from the north? Picture this: longships slicing through icy waters, monasteries burning, kingdoms collapsing, and in the middle of that chaos, a legendary warrior rising to defend a fragile land. Was King Arthur just a myth? Or was he the symbol of a resistance so powerful that it shaped how Britain survived wave after wave of invasion? In this video, we uncover the forgotten connection between Arthur's last stand and the Viking terror that followed centuries later. This is not just a story of swords and battles. It's a story of survival, identity, and the birth of a nation. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see history forever. We'll explain everything in this video step by step. Don't skip it. In the long twilight of Britain's forgotten centuries, after the legions of Roman Empire marched away and before the chronicles found their steady voice, there lived a story that has never fully surrendered to time. It is the story of a land exhausted by invasion, a people uncertain of their future, and a king whose name became larger than history itself, King Arthur. But to speak of Arthur is to step carefully between legend and longing. The Viking threat, the seaborne storm that would later crash against the shores of Britain in the 8th and 9th centuries, did not belong to Arthur's lifetime. The great raiding fleets, the dragon-prowed ships that terrorized monasteries like Lindisfarne in 793, came centuries after the age in which Arthur is believed to have lived. And yet, in the imagination of Britain, Arthur stands as something greater than chronology. He represents resistance itself, the eternal defender against the northern sea kings, who would one day threaten to unravel the fragile threads of the island's survival. To understand why Arthur is remembered as the one who stopped the northern tide, we must travel back to the 5th and early 6th centuries. Rome had withdrawn. The roads remained, but the discipline was gone. Cities crumbled into quiet ruins. Into this vacuum came waves of German settlers, Angles, Saxons, Jutes pressing inland, testing the strength of the native Britons. It was in this crucible that Arthur's name first flickered into view. The earliest surviving voice to mention him is not a court poet, but a monk. Nennius, writing in the 9th century, Nennius tells of 12 battles fought by Arthur against invading forces, culminating at Mount Badon. There, the Britons achieved a stunning victory. Later, another monk, Gildas, wrote of Badon as a moment when the tide turned, when Britain, for a generation, knew peace. Was Arthur the commander at Badon? The texts never quite say so with certainty. But over time, the silence filled with conviction. Mount Badon became more than a battlefield. It became a memory of deliverance. And so when later centuries trembled beneath real Viking raids, when monasteries burned and kingdoms fell, Britons reached back into their past and lifted Arthur higher. He became the model of the king who would not yield, the guardian of Christian Britain, the sword in the darkness. In truth, Arthur's world was already one of existential peril. His enemies were not Vikings, but Saxons. Yet the pattern was hauntingly similar. Long ships on the horizon, foreign tongues on the wind, settlements planted in contested soil. Britain had faced annihilation before. It had survived before. Arthur's legend taught that survival was possible. By the time Viking armies carved out territories like the Danelaw in the 9th century, Britain had changed. Kings like Alfred the Great would wage real campaigns against Norse invaders. Alfred reorganized defenses, built burhs, fostered learning, and refused to surrender. And in Alfred's stubborn resistance, one can almost hear the echo of Arthur, the idea of a king who stands when others fall. Arthur's sword, Excalibur, may belong to myth, but the longing it represents is profoundly human. It is the longing for order when chaos reigns, for unity when tribes fracture, for courage when defeat feels inevitable. The medieval chronicler Geoffrey of Monmouth would later weave Arthur into a grand tapestry of kingship. In Geoffrey's telling, Arthur conquers not only Britain, but challenges the very powers of Europe. The tale grows bolder with each retelling. Camelot rises, knights gather, a round table ensures equality and shared purpose. Why did these embellishments matter? Because Britain needed them to matter. When Viking longships pierced the misty horizon centuries later, they carried more than warriors. They carried terror. Monks fled with manuscripts. Farmers watched smoke rise where churches once stood. Entire kingdoms were remade by the sword. The threat was not only military, it was cultural, spiritual. In that era of fear, Arthur was not a relic of the past. He was a promise, the promise that invaders could be resisted, the promise that Britain could endure, the promise that Britain could endure, the promise that Britain, leadership, righteous, courageous, self-sacrificing leadership, could alter the course of history. We must be honest, there is no record of Arthur meeting a Viking fleet on the shores of Cornwall. No chronicle describes Excalibur clashing with a Norse axe. History does not give us that scene. But history does not give us that scene. But history does give us something subtler and perhaps more powerful. It gives us the understanding that nations survive not only through armies, but through memory. Through stories that define what a people believe about themselves. Arthur became the archetype of resistance. When Vikings ravaged Northumbria, when they seized York, when English kings fled into marshes and monasteries trembled, there lingered in the collective soul of the island the belief that Britain had faced darkness before and had prevailed. Arthur's victory at Badon, real or embellished, stood as proof. And so, in a way both symbolic and profound, Arthur did stop the Viking threat, not by sailing against them, but by shaping the identity of those who would. He stood at the beginning of a tradition of defiance that culminated in men like Alfred, and in the eventual forging of a unified English kingdom. The story of Arthur reminds us that history is not only a ledger of dates and battles, it is also a reservoir of courage, a language of hope spoken across centuries. In every age, there comes a moment when a people stand at the edge of uncertainty. The horizon darkens, the ships appear. Fear whispers that this time is different, that survival is no longer assured. And then someone remembers. They remember Mount Badon. They remember the king who would not retreat. They remember that Britain has endured storms before. In that remembering, Arthur lives again, not as a relic of myth, but as an enduring testament to the power of leadership, unity, and faith in one's homeland. The Vikings would come. They would come. They would burn and conquer and reshape the island's destiny. But they would not erase it, because somewhere in Britain's battered heart, the legend of Arthur still stood guard. And sometimes it is the legends we carry that make survival possible. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. When the last administrators of the Roman Empire gathered their records and departed the island of Britain in the early 5th century, they did not simply leave behind abandoned villas and fading mosaics. They left behind a question. Who would defend this distant province now that the imperial eagles no longer cast their shadow across its hills? For nearly 4 centuries, Rome had imposed order, sometimes harsh, often efficient, always authoritative. Roads stitched the countryside together, forts lined the frontiers, law and taxation, Latin speech and Christian worship, all flowed through imperial veins. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, that pulse weakened. By the year 410, as the empire convulsed under pressures from Goths and Vandals closer to its heart, Britain was told to look to its own defense. The legions were recalled. The frontier walls, Hadrian's mighty barrier and the northern defenses beyond, stood increasingly silent. The administrative class that had mediated between local Britons and distant Rome found itself without a patron. What remained was a landscape of towns built for a stability that no longer existed, and a population unaccustomed to governing itself in a world of constant threat. The collapse was not theatrical. It was gradual, uneven, and deeply unsettling. Villas in the countryside continued for a time, their owners clinging to Roman habits. But trade networks thinned. Coinage became scarce. Skilled artisans disappeared from the record. The great bathhouses cooled. Urban life, once a symbol of Roman order, receded into something smaller, more defensive. Britain did not fall in a single blow. It unraveled. Into this vacuum came pressure from every horizon. From the north, Pictish raiders tested the brittle frontier. From the west, Irish groups crossed the sea, seizing opportunities created by Roman absence. From the east and south came Germanic warbands. Angles, Saxons, Jutes, initially invited perhaps as mercenaries to shore up defenses against other threats. The arrangement, if it existed as later chroniclers describe, was born of desperation. A people accustomed to imperial protection now bartered for survival. With outsiders whose loyalties were transactional and whose ambitions were expanding, the Britons were not helpless, but they were divided. The Roman administrative framework had provided cohesion. Without it, local leaders. Some remnants of Romanized elites, others rising warlords competed for authority. Allegiances shifted. Old tribal identities resurfaced beneath a thin veneer of imperial unity. Christianity, introduced and nurtured under Roman rule, offered spiritual continuity, but it could not by itself organize armies or patrol coastlines. The physical infrastructure of Rome remained, yet its meaning changed. Roads that once carried merchants and officials now offered pathways for raiders. Fortifications that had symbolized imperial might became isolated refuges. The very tools of stability were repurposed in a new and harsher reality. It is in this atmosphere, uncertain, fearful, yet fiercely alive, that the earliest glimmers of a figure later called King Arthur begin to shimmer at the edge of history, not as a crowned monarch presiding over a polished court, but as a war leader in a fractured land. A commander, perhaps, who understood both Roman discipline and native resilience, a man shaped by the twilight of empire and the dawn of invasion. The Britons faced not a single catastrophic invasion, but a creeping transformation. Settlements along the eastern coast shifted linguistically and culturally. Archaeology reveals burial practices and material goods that signal a growing Germanic presence. What may have begun as federated allies became entrenched communities. Over time, these communities pushed inland, carving out territories that would become the seeds of future kingdoms. For the native Britons, this was not merely a military challenge. It was existential. Land was identity. Faith was identity. Memory was identity. To lose territory was to lose continuity with ancestors who had tilled those fields and worshipped in those churches. The absence of Rome did not simply remove soldiers. It removed a psychological anchor. The empire had been a guarantor of permanence. Without it, permanence seemed fragile. And yet, even in vulnerability, there was adaptation. Local strongholds emerged in the western regions. Wales, Cornwall, parts of northern Britain, where resistance proved more sustainable. Leadership became personal rather than bureaucratic. Loyalty attached to charismatic figures rather than distant emperors. In such a world, courage could alter the balance of power more quickly than decrees ever had. The memory of Rome lingered like an echo. Latin inscriptions continued. Christian bishops maintained correspondence beyond the island, but the sense of belonging to a vast, ordered civilization faded with each passing decade. Britain became more insular, more defensive, more defined by immediate survival than imperial aspiration. Chroniclers writing centuries later, such as Gildas, would look back on this period with a mixture of sorrow and moral urgency. Gildas lamented the sins of rulers and the calamities that befell the land, portraying invasion as both consequence and catastrophe. His words, though shaped by theology, preserve a sense of instability that must have felt overwhelming to those who lived through it. Fire on the horizon. Alliances broken. Fields abandoned. What makes this moment in British history so haunting is not simply the violence, but the uncertainty. The future was not yet written. There was no guarantee that Britain would remain culturally distinct. No certainty that its Christian identity would survive. No assurance that the language of its people would endure against the rising tide of Old English dialects spreading from the east. In that fragile space between collapse and consolidation, leadership became the decisive factor. The Britons needed not an emperor but a defender, not a distant authority but a present champion, someone who could rally disparate groups into a common cause against encroaching forces. The withdrawal of Rome forced Britain to confront itself. Stripped of imperial scaffolding, it had to rediscover its own capacity for resilience. The vulnerability of the 5th century was not only military, it was psychological. It demanded a reimagining of identity, no longer as a province of a global empire, but as a homeland worth defending on its own terms. The fall of Rome did not doom Britain, but it exposed it. It revealed the island's fault lines and its hidden strengths. In that exposure lay both danger and possibility. And in the anxious years that followed, as war bands tested defenses and communities chose between flight and resistance, the seeds of legend were sown in soil made raw by uncertainty. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share you deepest now in the comments below. In the hush between empire and invasion, when Britain's future seemed to hang by a thread, there rose a memory of a single battlefield that would echo Acro's centuries. The Battle of Mount Badon. It is a place wrapped in uncertainty, its exact location debated, its details obscured, but its significance in the early medieval imagination was unmistakable. Mount Badon was not merely a clash of arms, it was remembered as the moment when a battered people pushed back against annihilation and reclaimed, if only for a generation, the right to exist. The earliest voice to speak of this turning point was the 6th century monk Gildas. Writing in sorrowful prose, Gildas described a time when the Britons, after suffering devastating defeats at the hands of Saxon invaders, finally rallied and achieved a decisive victory at Badon Hill. He did not name the commander. He did not embellish the scene with heroic flourishes. Yet his testimony carries weight precisely because of its restraint. He wrote within living memory of the events. To him, Badon marked the climax of a struggle that had nearly consumed his homeland. The Britain of that era was fractured. Saxon settlements had taken root in the east and south. Native Britons had retreated westward, clinging to strongholds in Wales and the rugged terrain beyond. The advance of the Saxons was not a single invasion, but a relentless expansion, village by village, valley by valley. Fields were seized, churches were destroyed, communities displaced. The sense of irreversible loss pressed heavily on those who remained. Badon interrupted that trajectory. Later, in the 9th century, the monk Nennius would offer a more vivid account. In his telling, the commander at Badon was none other than King Arthur, and Nennius described Arthur fighting 12 battles against the Saxons, culminating in the great stand at Mount Badon, where he reportedly slew hundreds with his own hand. Whether these details reflect fact or flourish, they reveal how deeply the victory had embedded itself in cultural memory. Nennius's time, Badon had become inseparable from Arthur's name. The battlefield itself, wherever it lay, must have been a place of desperate resolve. Scholars have proposed sites from Bath to Wiltshire, but certainty eludes us. What matters more than geography is the emotional geography of the moment. Imagine a hill rising above contested land. Briton warriors, perhaps bearing remnants of Roman armor, standing shoulder to shoulder with farmers turned soldiers. Across from them, Saxon warbands hardened by years of expansion, confident in their momentum. The Britons had suffered before. They had seen their towns abandoned and their leaders divided. Badon was likely not their first attempt to halt the Saxon tide. But something changed in that encounter. Perhaps alliances finally held. Perhaps a single commander unified disparate factions under a common strategy. Perhaps terrain favored the defenders. Whatever the combination of factors, the result was unmistakable. The Saxon advance stalled. Gildas's account suggests that the victory ushered in a period of relative peace, lasting perhaps a generation. For a people accustomed to retreat, this pause would have felt miraculous. Children grew up without hearing the immediate drumbeat of invasion. Churches were rebuilt. Fields were replanted. The fragile thread of continuity, nearly severed, was tied again. In the medieval imagination, this reprieve took on spiritual overtones. The victory was seen not merely as military success, but as divine intervention. Gildas framed it within a moral narrative. Punishment followed by deliverance. The Britons, chastened by suffering, were granted mercy. Such interpretations infused Badon with a sacred quality, elevating it beyond a tactical triumph. When Nennius later named Arthur as the hero of Badon, he was giving flesh to a collective longing. Arthur embodied unity in a time of fragmentation. He represented courage unmarred by compromise. By attributing the victory to a single figure, the chronicler transformed a complex military campaign into a story of leadership. Whether Arthur was a historical warlord, a composite of several commanders, or a legend layered upon memory, his association with Badon crystallized the idea that one determined leader could alter the fate of a nation. The psychological impact of Badon cannot be overstated. In moments of existential threat, survival alone can reshape identity. For the Britons, the victory proved that the Saxons were not invincible. It disrupted the narrative of inevitable conquest. It suggested that resistance was not folly, but possibility. In societies where oral tradition carried history from generation to generation, such proof mattered deeply. Archaeological evidence aligns loosely with this narrative of interruption. The expansion of Saxon material culture appears to slow during the mid-6th century. While interpretations remain debated, the pattern supports the idea of a pause in aggressive settlement. Badon may have been the fulcrum upon which that pause balanced. Yet the peace it secured was not permanent. Over time, Saxon kingdoms consolidated and expanded anew. The Britons continued to lose ground. The island's linguistic and cultural landscape shifted irrevocably, but the memory of Badon endured precisely because it stood against the larger arc of loss. It was a reminder that history is not a straight line of defeat or triumph, but a series of contests in which outcomes hinge on human will. For later generations, especially during periods of renewed invasion, such as the Viking Age, Badon became a symbol of precedent. If the Britons had once halted the Saxons at a hill called Badon, then surely their descendants could withstand new threats. The battle's resonance extended beyond its CK DO, in shaping how Britain understood its own resilience. Arthur's association with Badon amplified that resonance. In poetry and chronicle, he became the warrior who carried the Virgin's image on his shield, the commander whose strength turned despair into defiance. Even if these embellishments grew with time, they testified to a truth deeper than documentation. Societies remember the moments when survival seemed improbable and celebrate the figures who made it possible. Mount Badon thus occupies a unique space between history and legend. It is both a probable military engagement in the early 6th century and a cornerstone of British myth. Its details are blurred, but its impact is sharp. It marks the instant when a vulnerable people drew a line and held it. In the centuries that followed, as chroniclers sought meaning in the island's turbulent past, they returned again and again to that hill. They saw in it the embodiment of unity, courage, and providence. They saw the face of Arthur emerging from the smoke of battle. They saw a Britain that refused to vanish, even when surrounded by forces that seemed destined to overwhelm it. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share you deepest now in the comments below. Long after the dust of Mount Badon had settled and the generation that fought there had passed into memory, Britain faced a new and more terrifying rhythm of invasion. The earlier struggle against Saxon expansion had been intimate, neighbor against neighbor, settlement against settlement, a slow reshaping of land and language. But the danger that emerged in the late 8th century came from the sea, sudden and merciless. It arrived with sails on the horizon and axes in the mist. The Viking Age had begun. The shock was unlike anything the island had experienced in generations. In 793, raiders descended upon the Monastery at Lindisfarne, a sacred place off the coast of Northumbria. Monks were slaughtered or enslaved. Relics were stolen. The sanctuary of prayer became a scene of bloodshed. Relics were stolen. The sanctuary of prayer became a scene of bloodshed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle would later record the terror in stark language, portents in the sky, famine, fear. For Christian Britain, this was not simply theft. It felt like judgment, yet beneath the fear was something older than panic. The island had known invasion before. The Saxons themselves, who now suffered under Norse attack, were descendants of those earlier migrants who had once driven the native Britons westward. History had folded upon itself. The former invaders now stood as defenders. The pattern was painfully familiar: foreign ships, coastal devastation, inland expansion. In this repetition of peril, memory stirred. By the 9th century, the legend of King Arthur had already grown beyond the sparse references of early chronicles. Stories circulated in Welsh poetry and oral tradition, celebrating a warrior who had once halted overwhelming odds. Though Arthur's historical lifetime, if he lived at all, belonged to the age of Saxon encroachment, his symbolic power transcended chronology. He had become the embodiment of resistance against the northern threat. Whatever form it took, the Viking incursions intensified rapidly. What began as seasonal raids evolved into sustained campaigns. Norse armies overwintered on English soil. They moved inland along rivers, seizing towns and demanding tribute. In 866, York fell to a great heathen army. Kingdom after kingdom succumbed. East Anglia, Northumbria, Mercia fractured and absorbed into what would later be known as the Danelaw. The map of England bent under pressure. The fear was existential. The Vikings were not merely plunderers. They were settlers. They carved out territories, imposed rulers, and introduced new legal and cultural forms. Churches burned. Royal lines ended. The sense of divine favor seemed uncertain. To many, it must have felt as though the island stood again on the brink of erasure. And yet, even as monasteries fortified their walls and kings negotiated uneasy truces, the story of Arthur lingered like a quiet inheritance. In Wales and Cornwall, in the borderlands where Celtic identity endured, Arthur was remembered as the one who had held the line at Badon. His battles were recited not as distant fairy tales, but as proof that overwhelming odds could be reversed. The power of that memory lay in its adaptability. Arthur had fought Saxons, not Vikings. But both threats came from across the sea. Both represented cultural displacement. Both tested the cohesion of the island's defenders. The legend provided a template. When unity replaces division, when courage overcomes fear, when leadership crystallizes fragmented will, survival becomes possible. It is no accident that during the height of Viking aggression, chroniclers began to gather and reshape Britain's earlier narratives. The 9th century saw renewed interest in the island's origins and heroes. Nennius compiled histories that elevated Arthur's exploits, placing him at the center of a national drama. These writings were not mere antiquarian exercises. They were acts of cultural preservation. In telling the story of Arthur's stand, Nennius offered reassurance to a generation facing its own storm. The Vikings themselves were formidable. Their mobility gave them strategic advantage. Their ships navigated shallow rivers, striking far from the coast. Their warriors were disciplined and fearless. But Britain was not without resilience. In Wessex, a young king would rise to confront the Norse threat with determination that echoed older legends. Alfred the Great faced near defeat in 878, forced into the marshes of Athelney as Viking. Mangy forces dominated much of southern England. The kingdom seemed moments from collapse, yet Alfred reorganized, rallied, and counterattacked. His victory at the Battle of Edington halted the Viking advance in Wessex and established a fragile balance of power. He built fortified towns, strengthened naval defenses, and promoted learning, seeking not only military survival but cultural endurance. In Alfred's defiance, one hears the resonance of Arthurian memory not as direct imitation, but as inherited expectation. A king must stand. A king must unify. A king must refuse surrender even when retreat seems the only rational choice. The legend had prepared the imagination of Britain to believe that such leadership was possible. Across the island, communities adapted, defensive burhs dotted the landscape. Alliances formed where rivalry had once reigned. Over time, Viking settlers integrated, intermarried, and contributed to the evolving fabric of English identity. The crisis did not erase Britain. It reshaped it. Norse words entered the language. Legal customs mingled. The conflict gave birth to a more consolidated sense of Englishness. Through it all, the story of Arthur endured as a quiet compass. In Welsh tradition, he did not die, but would return in the island's hour of greatest need. This belief, deeply rooted in Celtic imagination, transformed him from historical figure into eschatological promise. He was the once and future king, a symbol that Britain's darkest nights were not final. The attack on Lindisfarne had shattered complacency, but it did not extinguish identity. Just as Badon had once stalled Saxon expansion, so too did the resistance of Wessex and other kingdoms check Viking dominance. The parallels were imperfect yet powerful. In both eras, invasion provoked adaptation. In both eras, leadership mattered. In both eras, leadership mattered, and not only on swords, but on memory. The shift from Saxon threat to Viking fear reveals something profound about historical consciousness. Britain learned to see invasion not as unprecedented catastrophe, but as recurring challenge. The island's narrative became one of endurance through successive waves of upheaval. Arthur's legend served as a bridge between epochs, reminding each generation that it stood in a lineage of resistance. As longships carved their paths along rivers and smoke rose from coastal abbeys, the idea of Arthur hovered at the edge of collective awareness. Not as a literal defender with drawn sword, but as the embodiment of a conviction that Britain had faced darkness before and had found within itself the strength to endure. In every age of upheaval, a people searched not merely for protection, but for embodiment, for a single figure in whom their fears, hopes, and highest ideals converge. In the centuries following Rome's withdrawal from Britain, leadership ceased to be an abstract institution and became something intensely personal. Survival hinged on the character of a man who could command loyalty not through imperial decree, but through presence, courage, and conviction. It is in this crucible that the image of King Arthur emerged as the archetype of the warrior king. Arthur's power in the historical imagination lies not only in battles won, but in the type of leadership he represented. He was remembered as a dux bellorum, a war leader, rather than a crowned emperor. This distinction matters. Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries did not need pageantry. It needed coordination. Fragmented tribal groups required unity. Local rulers, suspicious of one another, needed a figure who could transcend rivalry. Arthur's legend answers that need with clarity. He gathered disparate forces and forged them into a common cause. The warrior king in this tradition is defined by juminate to danger. He does not command from distant safety. He rides at the front. Later medieval tales would embellish this trait, describing Arthur cutting through enemy ranks with superhuman prowess. Even stripped of embellishment, the symbolism endures. The leader must share risk with his people. Authority is earned in the clash of arms, not inherited without question. This model became deeply embedded in Britain's political consciousness. Leadership was measured not solely by lineage, but by resolve. When later generations faced renewed peril, they instinctively looked for figures who mirrored that Arthurian blend of bravery and moral gravity. The 9th century presented such a test. Viking armies advanced with discipline and ferocity, overwhelming established kingdoms. Into that maelstrom stepped Alfred the Great. Alfred's early reign was marked by crisis. Defeat forced him into temporary retreat, and the survival of Wessex seemed uncertain. Yet what distinguished Alfred was not the absence of adversity, but his response to it. Like the remembered Arthur, Alfred embodied resilience in the face of fragmentation. He reorganized his kingdom's defenses, constructing fortified burhs that created a network of protection. He restructured military service so that fields could still be cultivated while armies stood ready. His reforms were practical, grounded in necessity, but they also reflected a larger vision of stewardship. A warrior king must defend not only territory, but continuity law, faith, learning. Arthur's legend had long intertwined martial strength with moral purpose. Later chroniclers, such as Geoffrey of Monmouth, portrayed him as both conqueror and just ruler, presiding over Camelot with wisdom as well as valor. Though Geoffrey wrote centuries after the events he described, his narrative codified an expectation. The true king balances sword and conscience. The true king balances sword and conscience. Alfred's reign mirrored that balance. Even amid war, he championed education and the translation of key Latin texts into Old English. He sought to cultivate a literate clergy and informed governance. This intellectual revival was not separate from his military efforts. It was their complement. To defend a kingdom physically while neglecting its cultural foundations would have been hollow. In this sense, Alfred fulfilled the deeper implications of the Arthurian archetype. Leadership as guardianship of identity. The warrior king model also emphasized unity. Britain's early post-Roman centuries had been marked by division, and the memory of Arthur suggested that only collective action could repel invasion. Alfred worked to unify Anglo-Saxon territories under a shared vision of resistance. His diplomacy with Viking leaders, including negotiated settlements, demonstrated pragmatism without surrender. The warrior king must know when to fight and when to consolidate. Arthur's symbolic round table, introduced more fully in later medieval literature, reinforced this idea of collaborative leadership. Though likely a literary invention, the round table represented equality among knights, shared counsel, and collective responsibility. It offered an image of governance that was not purely autocratic but participatory. This concept resonated in later political developments across Britain, where councils and assemblies increasingly shaped royal authority. The enduring appeal of the warrior king lies in his humanity. He is not distant or divine. He is tested, wounded, uncertain, yet steadfast. Arthur's eventual fall at Camlann, in many versions of the legend, underscores the vulnerability inherent in leadership. Greatness does not exempt one from mortality. The king's body bears the cost of the kingdom's survival. This vulnerability deepened the archetype's emotional power. Dipped. Hen communities faced existential threats. Whether Saxon encroachment in the 6th century or Viking conquest in the 9th, they did not merely require strategy. They required reassurance that someone stood between them and annihilation. The warrior king became that living barrier. The model extended beyond Britain. Throughout medieval Europe, rulers invoked Arthurian imagery to legitimize authority. Banners bore his symbols. Courts embraced chivalric codes inspired by his legend. Yet in Britain, the resonance was uniquely intimate. Arthur was not a distant emperor. He was imagined as native soil made flesh. The archetype also carried moral expectations. A warrior king who fought bravely but ruled unjustly would betray the model. Arthur's legend insisted on a synthesis of strength and righteousness. This synthesis became a measuring rod for later monarchs. Courage without virtue was insufficient. Authority without sacrifice was hollow. In moments of national peril, the memory of such leadership shapes collective behavior. Soldiers fight harder when they believe their king shares their fate. Citizens endure hardship when they trust in the moral integrity of those who govern them. The warrior king is not merely a battlefield presence, but a moral center. Through centuries of retelling, Arthur's image expanded, armored in myth, crowned in poetry. Yet at its core remained a simple proposition that a single leader, embodying the will of his people, could alter the course of history. This proposition did not depend on the literal details of Arthur's campaigns. It depended on belief. As Britain confronted successive waves of invasion and transformation, the warrior king archetype offered continuity. It suggested that leadership rooted in courage and conscience could withstand even the fiercest storm. In Alfred's stand against Viking domination, in later monarchs who invoke the Arthurian lineage, and in the enduring cultural memory of Camelot, the model persisted, quietly shaping expectations of what a ruler must be willing to risk and what a people must be willing to follow. Long after the clash of shields at Mount Badon faded into the hush of uncertain memory, and long after Viking longships cut their paths through British waters, something quieter yet more enduring took shape. It was not forged in iron or carved in stone. It was fashioned in words, in monasteries lit by candlelight, in scriptoria, where ink stained the fingers of patient scribes. Britain armed itself not only with swords, but with story. Legend became national armor. The transformation of King Arthur from possible war leader into eternal guardian did not happen in a single stroke. It unfolded across generations, shaped by the needs of the present as much as by recollections of the past. Each century that faced uncertainty reached backward, reshaping Arthur into the defender it required. Among the most influential architects of this transformation was Geoffrey of Monmouth. Writing in the 12th century, Geoffrey composed the Historia Regum Britanniae, a sweeping narrative that wove together fragments of earlier tradition with bold imagination. In Geoffrey's telling, Arthur was no longer merely a commander who halted Saxon expansion. He became a conqueror of vast territories, a ruler whose authority stretched across Britain and into continental Europe. His court at Camelot shimmered with order and magnificence. His reign represented a golden age. Geoffrey's account was not neutral history. It was purposeful storytelling. Britain in the 12th century was itself negotiating identity. Norman rulers sat upon the English throne, and questions of legitimacy and continuity pressed heavily upon the realm. By elevating Arthur into a symbol of ancient unity and glory, Geoffrey offered a narrative that transcended political fracture. Arthur became proof that Britain had once been whole, powerful, and divinely favored. In doing so, Geoffrey helped transform memory into shield. Legend in times of threat performs a unique function. It stabilizes identity when borders feel unstable. It reassures a people that their present vulnerability does not define their destiny. The Viking Age had demonstrated how swiftly kingdoms could fall. Monasteries burned. Rulers were displaced and maps were redrawn. Yet the story of Arthur insisted that Britain possessed within its past the template for renewal. This transformation was not confined to Latin chronicles. In Welsh poetry, Arthur was portrayed as a warrior of supernatural prowess, battling giants and defending sacred spaces. These tales were not escapist fantasies. They were expressions of cultural endurance. For communities pressed by external dominance, legend provided continuity where political power could not. By the High Middle Ages, Arthur's story had expanded through the romances of continental writers, weaving chivalry, courtly love, and spiritual quest into the narrative. The Round Table symbolized equality among noble warriors, suggesting a political ideal that balanced strength with counsel. Excalibur, drawn from stone or bestowed by a mysterious lady of the lake, embodied rightful sovereignty. Each addition to the legend reinforced the idea that leadership must be both powerful and just. In times of northern threat, whether Saxon in the early centuries or Viking in the later, this ideal became psychological armor. It offered reassurance that Britain's survival did not depend solely on immediate military strength, but on adherence to deeper principles of unity and courage. Even as Norse settlers integrated into English society, their presence did not erase the mythic framework that shaped British self-understanding. The belief that Arthur would return in Britain's hour of greatest need deepened this armor. He was said not to have died, but to sleep, awaiting recall. This motif of the once and future king infused the legend with eschatological hope. It implied that defeat was never final, that beneath temporary subjugation lay the promise of restoration. Such hope is not trivial. Nations under siege often survive because they believe survival is possible. When the Viking Great Army carved out the Danelaw, reshaping large portions of England, the future of Anglo-Saxon rule seemed uncertain. Yet resistance endured, culminating in leaders who reclaimed territory and consolidated power. The cultural memory of earlier deliverance, embodied in Arthur, reinforced the conviction that history could bend back towards sovereignty. Even monarchs sought to cloak themselves in Arthurian legitimacy. Medieval kings traced genealogies to him, hosted tournaments evoking Camelot, and invoked his name to strengthen claims of rightful rule. The legend thus became not only armor against external foes, but also a framework for internal cohesion. It defined what kingship ought to be and reminded rulers that their authority rested upon ideals, as much as armies. The power of such myth does not lie in literal accuracy. It lies in shared belief. A people who see themselves as heirs to resilience behave differently than those who see themselves as perpetual victims. Arthur's legend fostered a narrative of endurance. It reframed invasion as challenge rather than destiny. Northern threats continued across centuries. Political alliances shifted. Dynasties rose and fell, yet Arthur's presence in literature, art, and public imagination persisted. He appeared in stained glass and epic verse, in ballads recited by hearthfire, and in manuscripts guarded by monastic hands. Each retelling reinforced the idea that Britain's identity was not reducible to the outcome of any single conflict. Legend as national armor also shaped moral expectations. Arthur's eventual downfall, often attributed to betrayal within his own ranks, served as cautionary tale. Unity must be preserved. Division invites catastrophe. In this way, the myth instructed as well as inspired. It warned that external enemies were dangerous, but internal discord could be fatal. Through Geoffrey's grand narrative and the poetry that followed, Arthur transcended the narrow frame of early medieval warfare. He became an emblem of Britain's capacity to withstand storms from the north, whether Saxon or Viking. His sword symbolized defense. His court symbolized order. His anticipated return symbolized hope. In the end, the armor forged by legend proved as significant as any shield carried into battle. It shaped how Britain understood its past and imagined its future. In the face of repeated incursions from northern seas, the island clothed itself not only in fortifications and fleets, but in the enduring conviction that it had once stood firm against overwhelming odds and could do so again if you found stillness in these words. Subscribe to join this space of presence and share you deepest now in the comments below. Thanks for watching this video, and don't forget to like and subscribe.